There are many ways of being part of this transition to a world without tailpipes, and it doesn't mean that the only way to be part of this is A, by being an expert, or by being a car owner.
You're listening to Climate Curious, a podcast for people who care about the world but find the current conversation about climate change confusing, boring, or scary.
Okay, Ben, here's a fundamental question for you. Do you know how to drive a car?
I feel very attacked in this moment. I don't know why that is relevant to this podcast, and for any potential women who will be looking to date me in the future. I'd like to say that I am not a scrub, because a scrub is a guy that can't get no love from me. But no, the answer to the question, Maryam, which is very aggressive, is no, I cannot drive.
Well, then I think you're going to love my second question. Do you know how to ride a bike?
I've trapped you because I do. Well, I don't really. I can. Once I rode a Boris bike through London, and it was it was one of the scariest moments of my life. I very nearly crashed into several buses, but I can survive I've proven it. I've evidenced it. Can you ride a bike?
No, I mean, this is what I was going to say is I'm here with you in solidarity. I also do not know how to drive a car or ride a bike, which is why I think in some ways we're unlikely people to be having this conversation.
Right.
But here we are. I'm really excited to have this conversation because I have to admit that I have actually always loved cars. I know that I can't drive, but I have this weird knack where I can actually recognize and tell you the model of any car.
Really? Did you?
Yeah, not the model. Maybe it's the make. Like I can tell you what, if a car is like a Nissan or
No way.
A BMW from really far away.
Were you super into Top Gear when you were little or something, or did you really like Hot Wheels, or I don't know, how you can?
I mean, I feel like I can't answer this question, but because I think it's gonna give people the wrong impression of me. But I can just say that before we knew that certain things were not things that we should watch because certain presenters were probably not people that we should be giving airtime to. I did indulge in those things, and
the shows that shall not be named. Sorry. Okay, I get it.
Anyway, so to say that I spent my whole life loving cars, even though I don't drive. And so for me, this conversation around electric cars, electric vehicles, and the climate change movement is super interesting because, I love traveling. I love driving around. So it's not something that I want to get rid of, but I want to figure out how we do this right. So that's why, Ben, I thought we should talk to our guest this week. Should I tell you a bit about her?
Yeah, who's our guest this week?
Okay, Monica Araya is her name, and her work focuses on accelerating the shift towards emissions-free transportation. And I've used quotes on that because she puts it a much better way, which is to say a world without tailpipes. She actually spoke at the TED Countdown conference that just happened, and is also part of the Climate Champions team, which is very fancy and means that she's part of the lead up to COP26. Anyway, all this is like a lot of acronyms that I've now thrown at you, so apologies.
It's fine.
But basically why I love Monica and her work and everything that she does is because she's actually really passionate about having this conversation in a way that doesn't require you to have a science degree. And so, but I thought we should have a chat with her.
Right, and that is very important because neither of us have science degrees. Do you have a science degree?
I mean, does psychology count as a science?
No, that's not a real one. No, I'm joking. Of course it does. Of course it does.
That's a whole other.
It's a different episode.
A whole other episode.
We'll do that later. Well,
great. Okay. Let's get going.
Okay. Hello, Monica. How are you?
Hello. I am doing really well. Very excited to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's just great to start this conversation with the tone you set out, because normally a lot of climate-related conversations are just so difficult and painful that I just enjoy just hearing you guys. It's just perfect. I'm getting curious.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, we are. I'm incredibly curious, and I feel like climate conversations, in my experience, often start like kind of on the back foot. Do you know what I mean? Like, especially for me, like I feel like I start from a place of like not knowing enough, and that makes me feel very defensive. And so like it's almost like I go into a conversation knowing nothing but really wanting to argue with a person about something I have no idea about, which is super weird. So, on that
That's a good way to approach life.
I know. Well, that's just my vibe. Do you know what I mean? But on that note, tell us a little bit about your work.
Well, I have had different lives, if you know what I mean. You know, it's not that I have done just one thing all these years, but there is one common topic, which is the fact that I do believe we will be better off if we live our daily life in a cleaner environment. You know, if we are smart about resources, if we do the best we can to have clean air, and there are many other dimensions. But for some reason, in the last years, I have become quite interested in the subject of oil and our relationship to gasoline and diesel. And in that sense, my work consists on doing everything I can to work with other people so that instead of using gasoline and diesel, we use renewable electricity for our transportation, because we're already using it for our phones, for our computers, for our coffee making process, for, you know, we dry our hairs with electricity and ideally with renewable electricity. So why would you keep using oil when electricity could do the job? I could tell you many stories, but I think the main one is that, as Maryam said, I think that the way to summarize what I do is to think about a city that will not have those tailpipe exhausts, you know, or exhaust tailpipes, as you call it. I think in the US is tailpipe. I lived there 8 years, so my accent is a bit more American. But let's just call them the tailpipe. If you think about it, that's the summary of success, because if we move to that world, you know, it's going to smell and it's going to taste very differently every time you go out.
Right, like every time you're on the road, every time you go down a motorway, it will smell. So when you say tailpipe, like for me, you mean exhaust
exactly.
pipe, right? Like the thing on the bottom of a car that spits out the black stuff.
And
right?
there are. I mean, if somebody's listening and that person says, you know, let's call her Mary, you know, or John or Ben, you know, one cool name there. Mm-hmm. If that person is listening and is saying to herself, but wait a second, I don't care about cars. I just love my bike. Why do I care? Well, fine. It's not about, we're not going to have a conversation about personal cars necessarily. It's about anything that has wheels. So if you take taxis or if you buy things and they get delivered through a van, we want that van to be zero emissions. Or if you say, I don't ever want to buy a car, fine, don't buy it. But you can be part of this if you work with your community and make sure that all those buses circulating are electric, you know, and are zero emissions. So there are many ways of being part of this transition to a world without tailpipes. And it doesn't mean that the only way to be part of this is A, by being an expert, or by being a car owner. We have to find beautiful ways of having this conversation where it's about discovery and curiosity. That's why, again, I love your concept, as opposed to lecturing people, as opposed to making them feel bad because they love cars or because they love whatever they love. I mean, let's just get that out of the way so that we get people as curious as possible. I just love the title of your podcast.
Okay, so let me ask you some questions around this. Electric vehicles, right? That's what they're called, EVs. So we might be using that acronym. Are they more than just Teslas?
Oh, yes. And it's so...
that wasn't the answer that I expected.
It's really, really important to give us many stories and visuals of what electric vehicles are. For example, an electric vehicle is a bus. So those red, beautiful buses that you see in London, they are an electric vehicle to the extent they use electricity and have no tailpipe. They are an electric vehicle.
Wait,
as
so
well. It's not just the Tesla. Tell me, Ben.
So buses in London don't actually... Do they not use...
Those new buses, Ben, the
Oh
shiny
my gosh,
new
I
buses.
didn't realise that. Wow, I'm such a
Okay,
rookie in this.
let me
This
ask
is ridiculous.
you. Let me
I'm
ask
so
you something.
embarrassed. Sorry.
Let me ask you. How do you
Yeah.
how do you know if you have two red buses in front of you, or
Yeah.
they're on? How do you know which one is electric from standing there?
At the side, the sound, surely.
Yes.
I feel like that's how I know. Like I can always tell that my Uber is electric because it hums when it drives up.
Yes. So basically, if it's zero emissions, if it's electric, it's going to be silent because you don't have that internal combustion engine burning that liquid that then gets out through the exhaust. So one of the big benefits, we don't talk enough about it, of this big switch to zero emissions options is the silence that you will get in a city. So the other way of thinking about it is electric vehicles that transport things, not just people, right? Like we tend to think of buses and cars transporting human beings, but a lot of the transit or a lot of the congestion we see is also because of trucks, or a lot of the pollution comes from heavy duty vehicles. And I think in the UK you call them lorries, which is
Yeah.
Yep. You're down.
and then we
with the
say
lingo.
trucks.
Red lorry,
But
yellow lorry.
I actually find that they are one of the big answers to this puzzle, because imagine they transport a lot of things, food, all the things we buy. So we have a lot to gain if all this tracking moves to zero emission options. It's exciting.
You know that when you said before about if I order something online, I think that's the first time that I ever thought about vehicles in that way of like if I'm somebody who doesn't drive and I only ride a bicycle, which I don't. If hypothetically speaking, obviously I can, but if I couldn't, and I only rode a bicycle, but I was still like ordering stuff online and it was getting delivered to my house, that I would still be complicit in that. That's such a weird thought. Like I'd never ever considered that before.
Yeah, and the thing is that the way to engage with this is through, in my view, one way to engage with this is to focus on the things that you really care about. So, for example, some people care a lot about their community, and they say, I can engage with the whole country, but I care a lot about my city. So one way of engaging is through your municipality or your the government of that community or that city. So they buy fleets, they engage with charging. For example, I am based in the Netherlands, and they have something called zero emission zones. I think in London you have ultra low emission zones. So the point of this is that you don't necessarily need to be working on this from the perspective of carbon or climate. You can engage with this from the perspective of building community, or from the perspective of technology, or in the case of Maryam, she says she loves cars. So I my point is, there is no one way of doing this. And of course, the point about Tesla is very important because it creates this love and hate at the same time. So for some people, the only way to engage with this is through a Tesla angle, because they love cars and they say, I love the idea of that. They would say beautiful car because it's beautiful, but it's zero emissions. And where they see beauty and excitement, perhaps a biker would see something completely different, would say, I see, it represents money and it represents an excess that I don't want in my life. I'm not going to judge you, because frankly, this is not about judging. This is about getting people to say, hey, I had a good idea. How about this? And then you go and help electrify, a whole fleet of municipal cars or a whole fleet of taxis. Let me conclude this by saying something that is, in my view, missing in a lot of conversations. You can like many things. You don't have to just like one. So one thing that I find very rigid, at least in social media, is that there is this tension between people who love bikes and some of them hate cars. And some people that are promoting the shift to EVs, electric vehicles. And you see this tension, and then there is this very odd way of saying, but EVs are not going to solve the problem. And it's like, okay, but nobody's saying that EVs are going to solve the problem. What we're saying is, let's go to zero emissions and let's have options. And I, for example, love my bike here in Amsterdam. I love it. I also love electric cars, and I also love buses, and I also love trucks. So it's not like if you like one, you have to hate the other.
I absolutely agree. I think, Monica, it's interesting in London, for a long time, you had bikers pitted against drivers, pitted against pedestrians. It became a moral argument on everyone's side. And actually, it's such a distraction. And we don't have time for that kind of stuff. And so actually, I've gotten this chance to work with you before. So I realized that there are these common myths that are really, really pervasive. And so I wanted to just go through 3 of them that I think would be really cool. The first one is something, Ben, you alluded to it in something you said earlier, and I wanted to come back to it. So you said, I know that my Uber is electric because it hums. And I was like, yeah, but you're talking about a car that begins with the name P. I don't know if we can say it, but that's fine. Okay. And that's a hybrid. So that's my first question for you.
Oh, is that not electric? Okay, no, ask the question.
Is are hybrids and electrics the same thing?
This is very, very important because, and it's pretty universal. So there was, just to give you a sense of how pervasive this is, there was a survey in Brazil, big country, and they asked people, what do you think when you hear the word electric car? And they say Tesla and Prius, which is really interesting because, well, Tesla is for obvious reasons. Elon Musk is a very visible person in a lot of debates. So that's pretty normal. But the thing about Prius is really tricky because at the end of the day, Prius or the hybrids first of all, I think they are part of the past. So let's just say that, and I'll say why. But basically, it's a car that is extremely efficient in how it burns gasoline and diesel, right? So it's about efficiency. So that was great. And at the time, especially in the US, it created this visual of the kind of green person that doesn't want to consume expensive cars. You buy a Prius, you do your part. And it's very interesting. The US has lagged so behind in the last years that a lot of my very good friends there that see themselves as green, they still say things like, yeah, okay, you're working on things like, with the Priuses, right? And I'm like, oh gosh, please read, please read. But the bigger point is this. The bigger point is that we can also think about the difference between incremental change and transformational change. I'm old enough to remember life without a smartphone. We have seen a transformational change. And if you had a fax company and you went through that change, you probably lost because you went through something else. So the same is happening to some degree to companies that were too stuck with hybrids, that now that is the time to leapfrog into zero emissions for fleets. They are resisting it.
Right. Because this for me is like, I genuinely did not know that. I didn't realize that my Uber wasn't, that it wasn't an electric car. I thought it was because of the noise that it made and it feels like super smooth. But so it burns, those cars like hybrids burn diesel more efficiently. And so is diesel a bad thing? Because I thought that diesel was it sounds like we're saying it's bad, but I thought that diesel was much better than petrol, or that was the future, and that was the direction we were supposed to be moving in. And my dad used to get really annoyed when we used to go to the petrol station, he had to use a different pump and whatever. I thought that was progress. So am I wrong there? Is that are we not doing the right thing?
It is really, really important to talk about diesel because breathing diesel will make people very ill. And if you look if you Google diesel, World Health Organization, you will find that the World Health Organization has determined that diesel is a, how do you say this in English, carcinogenic, that it gives you cancer.
Yeah.
And many in the auto industry for years try to block that. You know, it reminds me a little bit of the tobacco industry when they said, you know, that smoking was not that bad. So the point about diesel is that you're very right. For a while, for quite a few years, the narrative was, well, you know, since you have to use gasoline or diesel, you might as well choose diesel because it's cleaner. And over the years,
right.
much to the, you know, over the years, we have discovered through science that was not true. First, it was dirtier than we thought in terms of the pollution it creates, the harm it does to the quality of our air. And two, and here is the tricky part, there was a big scandal. You might recall, again, Google, if you go to Google and put Dieselgate, there was a second dimension to this problem, which was that when the environmental authorities in California were testing the cars, the diesel cars, they discovered that some companies had put a device that basically allowed that car to come across as cleaner during the tests, but then it would activate for, like, say 20 minutes, which is the time of the tests. And it has created a lot of tensions between, for example, the German public and German companies, because they feel the trust was broken. So, but let's look at opportunities. I do believe that the scandal around diesel has put the industry, most of them, in a better place, because now Volkswagen, which was at the center of this scandal, has become the company that is out there saying, yeah, we shouldn't have done this, but it's not just about an apology, we're moving to an electric era. So that didn't happen many years ago, and now they're saying.
Okay. That's so diesel is not good. Diesel
is very bad. Sure. Yes.
Diesel is bad.
Don't breathe it in.
That's not good for you. So Volkswagen is a good example. It sounds like are moving towards electric cars as the future, or electric vehicles as the future.
Yeah, but also the regulation in the European Union. I would argue, and I think many people who work with regulations agree, that it's a mix of things. You know, on the one hand, you have this in terms of the culture and in terms of the public opinion discussion, that was a big part of the breakthrough that electric vehicles had, because at the end of the day, it's about getting rid of the internal combustion engine that you have in these cars and saying, instead of using liquids, we're going to use renewable electricity. So there was that from the perspective of the public saying, well, at least we have another option. But at the same time, you have people fighting in places like Brussels, and meaning, you know, they need to make sure they lobby for stricter regulations for the whole car industry, so that what they do is not just volunteer actions. So the European Union has very strict CO2 regulations that are missing in the US. Wonder why? So strange. Why would the US not have strict regulations, on pollution? And basically the US is falling behind, with the exception of Tesla. The US right now is falling behind because they don't have that kind of regulatory push at the federal level. However, good news. I always like to point to good news. California has always been a very important exception, and a few weeks ago, literally, they passed a very important rule, which is starting 2035, they will not allow any sales of petrol and diesel cars, and 15 states in the US are going to follow suit, and they have historically been at the forefront of this. So being the equivalent of the 10th largest economy in the world, that's a very powerful signal. And the UK is going to have an announcement saying something similar in the next week. So
I feel like Arnold Schwarzenegger really makes all of the difference. You know what I mean? I feel like that is the core. That is really the core of what we're saying here.
Diesel
He's
Terminator.
terminated.
We need diesel
carbon emissions.
No, he's a really interesting case of a person who went from having do you remember the Hummer, that big car?
Yeah, the Hummer.
Oh, the Hummer.
He had,
yeah.
I think, at least 7 in his family, which is
oh my God.
it's ridiculous. He went from being that guy to being a guy that is totally into electric and pro climate. So it is interesting.
A beacon of change for all of us. Thank you, Arnold.
So, not where I expected us to be going today, but I love it. Okay, so Monica, we're seeing this shift in regulation, and we're seeing this shift in kind of businesses deciding to go in this direction as well. And let's say you are living in California. Are you going to be afraid that you're not going to be able to afford a car soon? Because that's the third thing that you kind of hear about electric vehicles. And when you look at the cost of a Tesla, for example, it is a luxury car. It's on that range. So, are we going to be priced out of being able to get cars?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because the short answer is the prices keep going down. And the good news is that by 2025, which is around the corner, structurally speaking, the price of electric vehicles, buses, vehicles, as vans or cars for personal use or fleets, are expected to be at the same level as their gas and diesel equivalent. So that's called price parity. So basically, the other thing that has happened is that China got into this game, and China, as you know, is the largest market for cars in the planet, and they missed the whole car revolution in the 20th century. It was basically German cars, European cars, and some American cars, not Chinese cars. And this century, they said, well, guys, here we come. We're gonna have, they call it new energy vehicles, and the Chinese have decided they want to conquer this market. So when you look at, for example, I'll give you a number you won't believe. They decided to, for example, produce electric buses. So right now, China has 420,000 electric buses versus around 3,000 electric buses in Europe, and about 600 electric buses in the US. Let's just continue. Let's repeat it. 420,000 electric buses in China versus 3,000 electric buses in Europe versus 600 electric buses in the US. Question for you. Wow. How many buses do you think Santiago de Chile has? 455. So that tells you that something is going on, and is the price. The price is going down because basically these electric buses coming from China are cheaper. So they are a game changer for a lot of countries that used to think that they could never afford an electric bus. For cars is the same, it's going down.
It's a really weird tangent to go on, but this is what it makes me think of. So during lockdown, I was watching this documentary on Formula One on Netflix, and I really had no interest in Formula One until I watched this documentary, and now I absolutely love it, and it's one of my guilty pleasures, I guess, in a weird way, because I think it's a terrible industry, but it's horrible, but it's also great because they go really fast. But in terms of what happens to Formula One, in terms of if we're moving away from gas and diesel and towards electric, and all of that surely changes an industry, and Formula One obviously is very niche, but in terms of industry in general, in terms of motor vehicles and developing them, surely I think this is one of my big issues with climate change conversations, is that it feels like the future is really bright, and there's this great thing. But for that to happen and for that to change, like you mentioned earlier, in terms of the transformation that we've lived through, like all of the people who owned fax companies and who worked in fax companies lost their jobs, right? Like they just don't exist anymore. So what happens to all of those people who work within those industries now? Like where do they go? Because surely that's like maybe like some kind of an equity issue. Also in terms of like the people who work in those industries by and large are not the people who make loads of money from those industries. So what happens to those individuals?
Okay, so let's first get Formula One out of the way.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Yeah. So I'll say something very concrete about that, which is that there is something called Formula E, which is super amazing. And you need to, if you like Formula One, you're going to love Formula E. And what is really cool about that is that for people who love races, what is really cool about that is that a lot of the guys from Formula E are shifting to, from Formula One are shifting to Formula E. Last week, cool. Literally last week, Honda left Formula One saying, guys, sorry, but the future is electric. So yeah, Google it too. So
oh my God. No way.
I mean, I think Formula E might have a new fan.
Yeah, well, it definitely does. Honda's left. I can't believe if you know how invested I was in this documentary, I'm rattled deeply. I've got like excitement veins in my forehead.
Okay,
right
but I don't want to ignore the question, the very important question you mentioned. Mm-hmm. I actually, before we get into car manufacturing, I actually think that there is a story by a woman who has the most incredible name. Her last name is Popcorn, which is kind of unusual. But anyway, she's a futurist, and her story was in The Economist, this very important publication, and she was an advisor to Kodak in the 90s or even before. And Kodak was already thinking about the digital transition, and they asked her to do a internal report about the future of photography. And she basically finished her report, went to the board of Kodak and said, the future is digital, is not paper. Paper photography is coming to an end of a cycle, so we need to... And she was fired. And there was this idea that, we didn't hire you to talk about digital photography. We hired you to tell us about the future of what we do. So my point with this is that things will change. It's not just electric cars or electric buses. It's a constant. You will go from certain industries to another, from faxes to smartphones. And that is why it's very important to choose between chaotic change versus some managed change or managed transitions. And one of the big words that we should be using in these discussions is that we need to make sure that this transition is actually managed and is fair. And the fairness part of this has to be very important, but it's also about transition. In other words, it's not we can't afford to get caught up into debates where the whole point is about why we cannot change. So in other words, the important conversation right now in the auto industry is about how to adapt, how to reskill the workers, how to retrain, and what to do with the reality of this change. And that is important because if you don't have this open discussion, it's just very scary, right? If you're just left on your own and you are told that this is going, we're not going to manufacture internal combustion engines anymore, and your job is going to be lost, and that's the only thing you hear, obviously you're going to oppose this. And my point is that countries that are taking this seriously also have calendars. It's not like this is going to end on Monday in every country at the same, it's not like the internal combustion engine is going to end next week at 3 p.m. everybody at the same time, zero emission. It's never like that. But we know from California that they are sending a signal. It's going to end in 2035, no more sales of this. in this market, and it's probably going to be bigger than California. So this is already a signal that you have 15 years for the auto industry to adapt. And what they cannot afford to do is to not start thinking about this with their workers. So in Germany, for example, which is the most iconic country when it comes to internal combustion engines, there is no secret about the fact that a certain generation of engineers pretty much hate the transition. You know, they just pretty much say, this is unacceptable, this is what we do well, why do we have to change? But the younger ones are excited. And my point is, every single country should be prepared. So I would probably, if I had all these workers in front of me, I would encourage them to ask the question of how they can be part of this, as opposed to getting too caught up into my job has to survive no matter what. And I don't know how the conversation is going in the UK, but I know that in Germany, they are starting to engage the workers, given that they no longer deny that this is going to happen.
So car manufacturers essentially need to become B Corps with a commitment to fairness. Look at me, I'm learning so much. I feel like I've made my first real link here, and this is really good. Look at the growth. That's so interesting.
I guess, it makes me think that there's a reason these workers are feeling nervous, right? Like, historically, they have not been looked after. And they look at their predecessors in coal, right? And they say, whole towns shut down. Yeah. Whole generations of people were just left by the wayside. And so I don't want that to happen to me. And I kind of get that feeling of it. It's almost like you need the car manufacturers to step up. You need the governments to step up. And I can imagine that in Germany, where you have more of a social state, where you have more of that, free education and the ability to retrain and all of that there are recourse to it. But I can imagine that in the US, in like Detroit, for example, it must be terrifying because you've got nothing. The government is not there to support you or help you in any way. And so I can see that. And yet, like you said, what I really took from that Kodak story, which I absolutely love, is it doesn't matter if Kodak wanted to or didn't want to hear about digital. It was going to happen anyway.
It's very important to create spaces where these workers participate. So in other words, it cannot be conversations just between governments and companies, even though that's very important too, because they probably is a big political negotiation of when you end, the manufacturing of these cars and trucks and buses. But at the same time, you have to engage them. Otherwise, in the end, it's not going to work, or it's going to be very painful. So there is that kind of structural thing that every government and industry will have to do. And as you said, Maryam, it depends really on the country. But at the same time, because we're not politicians, we're not in government making these decisions, in my experience, that human connection has to come at the very forefront of this. And the words I like to use is that you have to give people space to shift with dignity. You know what I mean? It's a human being, and it's a livelihood, and it's a person who is probably lovely and has children. They just happen to work in the oil and gas industry, or they produce the internal combustion engine. The problem is not that person. The problem is that the combustion engine will create exhaust and toxic fumes that are going to kill children. So it's about separating the technology, that is a problem from a scientific perspective, from that human being. There is no escaping from this, I don't think.
And I just want to ask one more question around this equity issue, because we've mentioned it from a jobs point of view, but there's something else here, right? Is that if we look at, because we have with this podcast, we want to have this perspective of cities, right? Like when we look at cities and we look at areas where you're seeing the highest, like big motorways, whether it's the North Circular, the South Circular, wherever it is, with massive trucks, I'm assuming, Monica, that these are not in like the nice posh parts of town. right? Like, is there another equity issue here?
Yeah, totally. And I think that is the core of the matter. I think, as we said before, there is the just transition element to it. And there is also a bigger question because it affects millions of people. I mean, if you look around the world, 9 out of 10 people do not breathe clean air, period. There is no denying that. And the most vulnerable are children. And the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable are children in low-income communities. And if you go country by country, and if you look at those low-income neighborhoods, you would find many other elements to it that create the most unfair picture that you can imagine. So, for example, in California, again, the equivalent of the 10th largest economy in the world, they have mapped pollution, air pollution in particular, and they have mapped these low-income communities, and often it's basically minorities too. From the years, a lot of people who, first or second or third generation immigrants, and they have less access to decision making. So when a lot of these trucks, for example, pass by neighborhoods, imagine the noise, imagine the pollution they leave behind. And now that California has also has decided to rule, to set up a rule to clean up trucks, one of the numbers that came out, I will never forget that. Basically, there are communities in California where the citizens of those communities have measured 1,200 trucks, diesel trucks, passing by every single hour. So if you think about what that does to you from a noise perspective, from your breathing perspective, from a quality of life perspective, it's not fair. and again, it can get really tragic, and you can get really down. But that, if you really want to look for light at the end of the tunnel, what worked in that particular case was a coalition, and the coalition was not just about climate. It had climate elements, of course, because you need to reduce carbon emissions, but the core of that coalition was also justice, and it was a mix of people from the community. And my lesson from California for people who are listening is that people can make a big difference. In this case, somebody called Mary Nichols, who is this fantastic woman who's about to retire, and she's a grandma. She is the woman who leads an office in California that deals with clean air. That's her job. And she went for it with this coalition. And they basically said to the industry, look, we're going to create a market for you. Because now by 2035, at least half of the trucks in California will have to be zero emissions. And honestly, hats off to Mary Nichols and that coalition, because they set us an example for the world. It's the first time that a place that big has a regulation that says we're not going to let this happen anymore. It's possible.
Do you know what? I think that this conversation is so important, because I think what it's done really nicely is it's painted a really important picture for me about the ways that we talk about these issues. I feel like it's so well rounded in that we started with this idea of the dream of a better future and a cooler future for kids, and people being able to access things that they love and things that they believe in and things that they want to experience, but then also came back to this idea. And I think it's really important that we stay grounded in this idea of justice and equity, and what it looks like for the world to be a fairer place for everybody that lives here. And I think that that's a really beautiful conversation for us to have. It also leads us really nicely to the last section of the podcast. And one of the questions that I want to ask you is, let's say everything that we're talking about goes as planned, and the rest of the world follows suit. Everybody starts to operate like California. In the next couple of years, let's say 10 years, what does the world that we're living in look like then?
I think in 10 years, when we succeed, I don't want to say if, but I want to say when we succeed,
Right.
at least in many places, maybe not in all places, I think the main way of noticing the change will be in your everyday life, because you will be in a place like, say, Bogota, the capital of Colombia. And the main thing you will notice is the change in how the city smells. We got used to pollution. We normalized it. And I think the tailpipe is that symbol of those terrible habits that we have and that we got used to. So just close your eyes and just think about the fact that you will have motorbikes, you will have cars, you will have taxis, you will have trucks passing by, and that smell that now feels normal is not going to be there. So I think we have to remember that at the end of the day, much of this change is going to be very concrete in the benefits it brings for us, so it's good for the climate, of course. We need to lower carbon emissions from a global perspective, but from an everyday life perspective, this has lots of benefits. The other thing is that the sound of the city will be very different. Because I pay attention to noise, I increasingly pay attention to how much noise there is in the streets, especially like there's loud trucks. And once you start paying attention, try to do it this week. Every time you go in the street, try to listen and say, when did it happen that we thought this was normal? So that combination of cleaner air and quieter roads is something that I would like people to think about, because it is, to some extent, it is about this will succeed to the extent that people say this is the smarter thing to do. And I will insist, given that there is so much division in every country, even in Costa Rica, where I come from, a small country of 5 million people, everyone like fighting. I find that having discussions that are about what's the right thing to do, and I'll tell you what the right thing to do is, that kind of discussion, I understand where they come from, but I don't think it works. I think we should lower down a little bit this discussion of the right thing versus the wrong thing and say, what's the smartest thing to do? Honestly, like, what's the smartest thing that this city could do? And then bring people on board based on those really smart things that we can do. We have the technologies right now. The barrier is not the technology.
Amazing. I mean, you know what it made me think of, Monica, actually, and Ben, I don't know if you're too young to this, but
We'll see.
Well,
We're
find
gonna
out.
find out.
yeah. So, do you remember? This is such a bizarre analogy for me, but it's like it just popped into my head. I remember going out in university, out dancing and clubbing in the evening, and you come back and you smell pretty bad, but be like whatever. And then I remember when they put in the smoking ban, and you come back after a night out and we smell your hair and you think, oh, it doesn't smell like disgusting anymore. And it was something that you didn't notice. I noticed the griminess, but it was kind of part of the deal before. And now, if you go somewhere and you get that smell again, which is very, very rare, you notice it right away, and you're like, "Oh, how did we ever live like this?" So it's that moment of, Monica, I know you've used it before as well. It's like smoking on airplanes. How did we ever allow?
And that's
that
how
to
you
happen?
and I met. We met through that conversation. But
Yes.
It's so true. That's what you're saying is so true. Ben, did you ever go to a place?
No. I was like playing with Beyblades when that was happening. I don't remember a smoking ban at all. I know it happened. I may have studied it in history.
Oh my
No, I'm
God.
joking.
Okay, Monica, let's get to our second to last bit, or our last question of this segment. If people have listened to this episode and they feel really motivated by what you're saying, what is one thing that they can do?
Oh, that's very important. So there are different things you can do. So one is, if you don't have a car, totally fine. You could work trying to electrify the buses of your community, to finding out who makes that decision, and working through a local organization usually is very good. My advice is always to look for allies and work with others, as opposed to try to do that by yourself. You know, if you want to write a letter, great, but it's always better to work with an NGO. If you do have a car, if you want to change it at some point, there are many options. There will be increasing options. So that is also a way of being part of this, you know, by saying, okay, I can actually switch to zero emissions. How do I do that? If you don't want to do that, you could also join, for example, or support organizations that are working towards zero emissions. So there are increasingly many NGOs, electric mobility associations, citizen to citizen discussion has been very important in many countries. Another way of supporting this is by having conversations with family members and others who are skeptical, and then, you know, get them to listen to this podcast.
Listen to this. Do you know what? That is so important, and what I think I really appreciate, and what I imagine our listeners will also really appreciate, is that there are really practical steps, like even down to just, if you've listened to this podcast, like, let somebody else, like, share this podcast with somebody else, because I think sometimes it feels so overwhelming, like, to know what to do, like in the conversation, especially like a conversation around electric buses and electric cars and Formula One and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Like, how do you know where you're supposed to go? But that organizing, like in your local community, trying to change stuff on a local level, having conversations, I would say, is always like a major thing. So thank you so much for sharing that. And we are gonna go into our last little segment, which is climate confessions. And now it's time for our climate confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick.
This segment is called Climate Confessions, and basically this is a place where we all get to just get a little bit honest about how we're not maybe perfect when it comes to the sustainable or environmental decisions and behaviour. So this week, Ben, do you want to start?
I will, and I've got a really easy one because I didn't know this before, but my climate confession evidently is that I continuously use Ubers when they are hybrids and not flipping electric cars, and I didn't even know. So maybe I've got to start thinking of more creative ways to get around that are less polluting or pollutant-ish. I don't know what the word is, but do less damage, burn less diesel or petrol or fuel. But that is like a really practical one that came up for me just now because I had no idea about that. So thank you for sharing that. Maryam, do you want to go?
Sure. So mine is that I have been known in the past to take a flight just for the points.
Oh, savage.
Savagery. However, given that now I've basically had to go cold turkey for 7 months on flying, I feel like going forward I can make better decisions.
Yeah.
Here's to hoping.
Yeah, I think... right,
Monica?
Well, two things. One is that I am living in Amsterdam and my family is in Costa Rica. So I've been thinking a lot about flying and you know, the carbon footprint. So my decision is to reduce all my work-related travel to pretty much zero, so I can just do everything by Zoom, and then save all my carbon pollution for that one trip that is very important for me for personal reasons. So one point I want to make is that I have not come to a point where I can say I'm not going to fly ever again in my life, which is what some people are saying, because the older families probably are in the same country. So there is that. But I think that's not what I struggle with the most, because somehow I think I have found a way out of that. I do confess that even though I have tried my best to conceptualize the notion that I have already bought all the clothes that I need for the rest of, not my life, but for a certain period of time. And I don't have that many, but I have enough. I still struggle when I see a nice blouse, for example, and I notice how, even though my objective, rational, database part of the brain is like, yep, you do not need an orange shirt, and the other brain is like, oh yes, that shirt, the orange is happy, it's something that is fun, and and look at this, look at that. So the interesting thing is that I can actually see the two brains going like into this battle, and sometimes one part of the brain wins, and I just walk out and say, no, I don't need it, but I have to confess it, and why not? I'm human. Everybody's human, I hope. Sometimes I just go for it, and then I feel really guilty afterwards. But I don't do fast fashion. I don't do fast fashion anymore.
This has been a very therapeutic confessional, actually.
Yeah.
I did not think I was going to tell you all about that when it came to flying, but I decided to be really, really honest. Well, Monica, it's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Speaking to you. I mean, I love this conversation. I think it's amazing. I hope everyone listening enjoys it as much as we did. Ben, what do you have we moved you further in the optimism?
Yeah,
scale?
yeah, I did. Do you know what? I really didn't expect to be moved, but I have been. I think Formula E really did it for me, to be honest.
Who would have thought?
I feel like that has changed my mind completely on this issue.
I'll when social distancing is over, we'll go to a pub and watch Formula E together. Monica,
I will.
Yeah, you
I'll
have to
take
come
the
as well.
train
That'd be
from
good.
Amsterdam to London.
Yes, not the plane.
Perfect.
Especially not for the points.
All right. All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us this week. If you enjoyed what you listened to today, please rate and subscribe and share the episode with a curious friend. Join the conversation on socials using the hashtag ClimateCuriousPod and let us know what you want to hear about next time. You can find us online at TEDxLondon.
This podcast was made possible by TEDxLondon's headline partner, City. City is all about progress and supporting great ideas. And for the past 5 years, they've supported us to bring world-changing ideas to the TEDxLondon stage. Now they're taking it to the next level by supporting this new podcast. Thanks, City. This episode was produced by Josie Coulter, curation and research by Tara Cooper, engineered and mixed by Ben Beheshti, artwork designed by Sabrina Russo and Rebecca Mingus, music composed by Ben the Falcon Beheshti, presented by Maryam Pasha and Ben Hurst.